In the forgotten corners of Asia's countryside, where the mist clings to the earth like breath held too long, ancient whispers still travel through the trees. Here, in villages untouched by time, traditions live on, some sacred, some cursed. This is folk fear, where ancestral rites become chains and the dead never rest quietly. Tonight, we unravel a tale rooted in the marrow of rural superstition, of bone-bound spirits, forbidden ghost marriages, and a curse that has haunted bloodlines for generations. In the village of Tanxi, when the rain falls and the wind carries the scent of incense, they say the bone bride walks once more. She was promised a husband in death, and she has waited long enough. Turn down the lights. Let the silence grow. This is not just a story, it is a ritual, and you have just begun to listen. The road to Tanxi was not one the maps like to remember. It twisted through the southern hills like a thread unraveling through fog, bordered by weeping willows and fields of forgotten rice paddies. The car bumped over stones and potholes as if the land itself rejected modern tires, forcing Zhao Wen to slow until even the engine began to whisper. Wen kept one hand on the wheel and the other on Lin Yu's leg, a quiet reassurance. She said nothing, her eyes fixed on the windshield where rain had begun to mist. The air was heavy, thick with the kind of dampness that carried a weight deeper than water. Something spiritual, almost ancestral. Tanxi was like that, a village wrapped in stories, sealed in silence. Wen hadn't been back in more than 20 years. He was 8 when they moved to Guangzhou after his uncle's mysterious death, the one no one ever explained. He barely remembered the house, only that it smelled of sandalwood and oil lamps, and that his grandmother's face had always been half in shadow. Now he returned as a man, an architect, with a fiancée and a future. Lin Yu, a modern woman with sharp eyes and a graceful composure, was excited to see the roots of her husband's family. She had insisted they hold the wedding in the ancestral village, in the old house if it still stood. She believed in honoring blood. She believed in heritage. The road narrowed to a gravel path flanked by moss-covered stones. A wooden sign swung crookedly in the breeze, characters carved so long ago they'd begun to vanish. Tanxi. As they entered the village proper, time itself seemed to slow. The houses were old, crouching low like beasts hiding from the sky. Tiles sagged, walls bore the stain of decades, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys that hadn't changed in a century. Villagers paused their sweeping, their stitching, their whispering. Eyes followed the car, not curious but suspicious. Some stared without blinking. One old woman, hunched and wrapped in layers of dull red cloth, raised her hand as if to wave, then turned it over and spat at the ground. Lin Yu's fingers tightened on her coat. Wen gave her a quick smile. They're just not used to outsiders. Don't mind them. But I'm not an outsider, she said softly. Not anymore. The house stood at the far end of the village, nestled beneath a slope where pine trees pressed close to the roof, as if to try to pull the house back into the forest. It was larger than Lin Yu expected, with sloped black tiles and high wooden beams carved with faded phoenixes and dragons. The front doors were chained with red thread, a local superstition, Wen explained, to keep the spirits from wandering while the house lay empty. Inside, the air was stale and warm, as though it had been breathing alone for too long. Dust coated every surface, and the faint scent of melted wax and damp stone lingered beneath the wood. "It's beautiful," Lin Yu whispered, running her hand over the altar in the main hall. Her fingers paused at a porcelain bowl filled with hardened black rice. "Is this old offerings?" Wen said. "They'll clean it tomorrow." A photograph of a man and woman rested above the altar, both dressed in traditional clothes. Their expressions were unreadable, eyes dull from time and glass. "My great-grandfather," Wen murmured, "and the wife he married after his first son died. Strange tradition. I don't know much." They unpacked as night fell. Outside, the villagers resumed their murmuring, their footsteps pattering like mice beneath the windows. At one point, Lin Yu peeked through the curtain and saw a small group standing just beyond the gate watching the house in silence. She drew the curtain shut. Later, at dinner, she asked Wen about the family history. "There's not much to say," he replied. "My father never talked about this place. He said Tanxi is where things were buried and should stay buried. The only reason we came back is because the villagers invited us. That's the part I still don't get." "They invited us?" He nodded. "They sent a letter, handwritten, said the Zhao bloodline must return for its rightful ritual. I thought it was just quaint, old-fashioned, you know." Lin Yu don't reply. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the dark, a bell rang once, a hollow, rusted sound. That night, she couldn't sleep. The house creaked in ways that felt intentional, not random, like something shifting with purpose. She wandered the halls barefoot, drawn to the ancestral altar, now faintly lit by moonlight slipping through a crack in the roof. There was a mirror missing from the wall. A rectangular shadow marked where it once hung. Lin Yu found herself staring at the emptiness, trying to imagine what it reflected. When she turned to leave, she heard it, a soft dragging sound across the floor, slow, wet, like something soaked in water moving over wood. She froze, waited, nothing. The sound stopped, but the air shifted, and in the faint light spilling from the hallway, she thought she saw, for a second, the hem of a red silk dress disappearing behind the edge of the doorway. She stood there for a long time, her breath barely moving, her heart pounding in rhythm with something ancient in the walls. Then slowly, she backed away and returned to the bedroom. Wen was asleep, or pretending. The village, the house, the very air, it all felt like it had been waiting. Not for them, not for joy, but for something old and unfinished to begin again. And Lin Yu, as she closed her eyes, knew something was watching them, not with hatred, but with longing. Something that had waited far too long to be a bride. By morning, the storm had passed, but the sky lingered in shades of pale gray, as though reluctant to commit to light. Mist clung to the village, threading through the trees, curling under rooftops, and wrapping the house in a stillness that felt too deliberate. Tanxi did not wake with the sun. It stirred like something ancient, slow, and suspicious. Lin Yue stood in the center of the main hall, her eyes scanning the walls again. She hadn't spoken of what she saw the night before. It felt too fragile, like naming it might give it form. Instead, she let her unease follow her eyes as she turned in a full circle. There were no mirrors, not a single one in the house. Not above the wash basin, not in the bedrooms, not on the wardrobe doors. The only reflective surface she could find was a small, polished metal plate tucked deep inside an old drawer, scratched and clouded like it had tried to forget its own purpose. When she asked Wen about it, he looked up from fixing a broken door hinge and shrugged. Mirrors are taboo in some old homes. They believe mirrors steal the soul, especially during mourning. Maybe my grandmother removed them after someone died. We'll bring one from town tomorrow if it bothers you. But it wasn't just the absence that bothered her. It was the memory of the mirror-shaped shadow above the altar. Something had been there, and now it was gone, deliberately, cleanly, as if whatever it showed had been too much. Later that afternoon, the villagers came to visit, not with joy or curiosity, but with obligation. 3 elders, each older than time, stepped into the house as if walking into a shrine. Their hands were pressed together respectfully. Their eyes avoided Lin Yue, but lingered on Wen. One of them, a man with white eyebrows that arched like crescent moons, spoke first. "Zhao Wen, son of the bloodline, we welcome your return to Tanxi. This house breathes again because of you." Wen nodded politely. "Thank you for letting us hold our wedding here." Another elder, the woman who had spat the day before, stared at Lin Yue with watery eyes. "She must be strong. The bride must not tremble, or the soil will shift. The bone bride is jealous of the weak." Lin Yue blinked. "I'm sorry?" Wen laughed awkwardly. "Forgive her, she's just—" But the woman turned sharply. "No mirrors, no silver, no combing hair after dusk, and no offerings unless instructed. The shrine beneath must never be disturbed." They left shortly after, leaving behind a thin trail of sandalwood and unease. That night, Lin Yue searched the guest rooms for candles and came across an old box wedged behind a cupboard. Inside were faded letters, yellowed talismans, and a small porcelain comb. When she touched it, the air grew colder. The comb was white, almost bone-colored, and carved with tiny red flowers. It pulsed slightly in her hand. She blinked, and it was still. Then, beneath the box, a warped floorboard. She pried it open with a kitchen knife. Dust erupted in a slow exhale, and below was a narrow crawl space lined with brick and earth, just deep enough for a person to lie down inside. A hidden cavity beneath the room. She dropped a flashlight down. It landed beside a shrine, small, old, and forgotten, but unmistakably a shrine. Its candles had melted into grotesque puddles. A child's porcelain bowl sat crooked, filled with blackened rice. There was a cloth doll, stitched from red silk, its face worn smooth. And behind it, resting against the dirt wall, a photograph of a young woman. Her face had been scratched out, gouged by fingernails, not time. All that remained were delicate ears, long black hair, and the faint outline of a red cheepaw embroidered with golden thread. As she stared, she heard it again. Dragging, wet, slow. This time, directly beneath her. She dropped the board back into place, sealing the crawl space in haste. Her hands trembled, breath short. Later that afternoon, she asked Wen about the girl in the photo. He frowned. "There was a cousin who died young, my father's side. I think her name was Zhao Shu. She drowned when she was 16, or 17. They said it was an accident, but... He hesitated. But there were rumors that she killed herself to avoid a marriage, that the boy had already died and she was being promised to a ghost." "A ghost marriage?" "Yeah, it's an old custom. When someone dies unmarried, families pair them with another dead soul. Sometimes they use bones, hair, or even dolls filled with ash. Creepy stuff." "Do you think your family did that?" He looked away. "Maybe, but what does it matter? It's just stories." She didn't answer, because later that night, when she brushed her hair before bed, she used the porcelain comb. And in the mirror-like gleam of the window, she didn't see her own eyes looking back. She saw a girl in red, face wrapped in gauze, standing behind her, dripping water onto the floor, smiling with lips sewn shut. And when she turned around, There was nothing there, but the comb lay on the floor, wet, cold. And the mirror above the altar, the one that had once been removed? She found the broken shards of it hidden behind the altar base, tucked into a hollow carved into the wood. Each shard showed something different. One showed Wen, sleeping. Another the empty bed beside him. A third reflected Lin Yue's own hand, but not her face. And the fourth shard? It showed a bride in red, holding a bouquet of bones, standing in the hallway waiting. Not outside the house, inside. The next morning, Lin Yue didn't mention the comb. She didn't speak of the broken mirror shards tucked behind the altar or the girl in red reflected in the glass. Some truths, once voiced, became permanent. Some things, once believed, couldn't be unbelieved. Instead, she moved carefully through the ancestral house, her footsteps slow and measured. She noticed the cold spots now, how the kitchen held its breath near the stove, how the hallway felt narrower at night, as though unseen shoulders brushed past. There were faint water stains creeping along the ceiling, new ones. She'd wiped them the day before. She kept returning to the crawl space. The memory of the shrine below the floorboards pulled at her like a thread tied to her spine. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't fear. It was something older, deeper, a sensation like obligation, like grief. That afternoon, when Wen left to visit the village hall and speak with the local marriage registrar, Lin Yue returned to the guest room. She locked the door, pulled up the floorboard again, and lowered herself slowly into the crawlspace, flashlight in hand. The earth was dry, but the air was moist. It smelled of mildew and candle wax and old paper prayers. Her knees pressed into cold stone as she reached the small altar, brushing away a layer of dust. The shrine was older than she remembered. The porcelain bowl wasn't childlike. It was funerary, patterned with lotus and pine, cracked along the rim. The melted candles had faces, tiny ones, carved into the wax like screaming mouths frozen mid-ritual. And behind the photo of the girl in red, now barely visible from mold and age, something was carved into the brick. She brushed at it with trembling fingers. 3 characters. Gu Xin Yang, the Bone Bride. Lin Yue whispered the words aloud. The flashlight flickered. Suddenly, the soil shifted beside her. She turned the light slowly. A bundle of rags, soaked through with black water, lay nestled against the shrine wall. She hadn't seen it before. Something wet dripped from its edge. She leaned closer. It wasn't cloth. It was a wedding veil, red silk, rotted, wrapped around a bundle of bones no longer than a forearm. The fabric clung to splinters of ivory, stained with old incense ash. And beneath it, a comb, identical to the one she had found upstairs. She reached for it, and the veil twitched. Just once. Enough. She scrambled back, heart pounding, scrambling from the crawlspace like something chased her, sealing the floorboard so fast her fingers bled against the wood. The house was silent again, but it was a silence with edges, watching, waiting. When Wen returned, she tried to speak, but the words felt brittle. Instead, she showed him the photograph. He went pale. That's her, Zhao Shu. I found another picture in my grandfather's journal years ago. He wrote that she was meant to marry a boy who died suddenly, and that her parents refused the ghost wedding. But your family didn't. He looked at her slowly. No, they didn't. That night, Lin Yue couldn't sleep. The rain returned, gentle at first, then heavier, falling in sheets like fingers drumming against the roof. Outside, the trees bent in the wind, and the village shrunk into darkness. She sat at the altar, staring at the cracked bowl of rice. The offerings had been replaced by the villagers earlier that evening, without permission, without sound, just an old woman arriving at dusk, her feet bare and her mouth stitched in prayer. She placed rice soaked in black water into the porcelain bowl. When she asked why, she only said, "She's hungry, always hungry." She was buried with no vows, no incense, no name. Then she vanished into the night. The wind grew louder. Lin Yue lit a candle and placed it beside the altar. She whispered, "What do you want?" The flame danced wildly, flickering so fast it nearly snuffed out. The air turned cold. Behind her, footsteps creaked across the wooden floorboards, slow, wet, dragging. She turned. Nothing. But the flame stayed tilted, not bending with wind, but as if drawn by presence. That night, Lin Yue dreamed of water. She stood waist-deep in a flooded room, the floor beneath her gone, the ceiling above her sagging with rot. Around her floated pale arms and long strands of black hair. A wedding veil drifted past her face, brushing her lips. And then she saw her, the bone bride sitting at the bottom of the water, head tilted, face obscured by red cloth, hands full of rice and teeth. Lin Yue woke choking, coughing violently. She spat water onto the floor. Not saliva, not air, water, black and cold. Wen woke and held her, frightened. "It's just a nightmare," he whispered, "just a dream." But her pillow was soaked, and from under the bed, the faint sound of dripping echoed like something breathing through the wood. The next morning, Lin Yue found her fingers stained with soot. She hadn't touched the shrine since yesterday, and yet a new offering had appeared on the altar overnight, a wilted lotus flower, and inside its petals a small note written in delicate brushstrokes. It said simply, "Bride must take her place." The village temple sat at the edge of Tanxi, where the trees grew too close together and the fog never fully lifted. A crooked path led there, paved with cracked stone tiles and overgrown roots, as if the earth was trying to erase the way. It was here that Lin Yue and Wen arrived after 3 nights of growing dread. The dreams, the dripping, the blackened rice, it was all leading here. The temple keeper was a thin man with paper-dry skin and eyes the color of old wood. He wore robes that hadn't been washed in months and walked with a limp, though no one could tell from where it came. When he saw Wen approach, he stopped sweeping and bowed stiffly. "You're the last son of Zhao blood," the man said, his voice as soft as incense smoke. "It's time you were told the truth." They followed him into the temple, past crumbling statues of Taoist immortals and faded offerings long turned to ash. The inner chamber was cold, even though the air outside was stifling. The man lit a stick of incense, closed the door, and pulled from behind a bamboo screen a worn wooden box. He opened it. Inside were bones, small, fragile, arranged carefully on red silk, a child's hand still bearing a jade bracelet, a jawbone, 2 fingers curled inward. Zhao Shu, the one they now call the Bone Bride. Lin Yue's breath caught. She was 16 when her parents promised her to a dead man. Not just any dead man, Zhao Min, your great-uncle, a firstborn son who drowned in the irrigation canal just days before his wedding. The family couldn't bear the shame of an unwed death. They insisted he be buried with a bride to join him in the afterlife. They arranged a ghost marriage? Wen asked, voice trembling. No, the girl's family refused. They said marrying their daughter to a spirit would bring ruin, and they were right. But your ancestors, they would not be denied. The old priest looked at Lin Yue. They stole her bones from the riverbank, performed a forbidden soul-binding ritual, and wed her spirit to the Zhao family. No temple would sanction it, no monk would bless it. So they turned to something older. He pulled a scroll from a hidden drawer, brittle, yellowed, and reeking of mildew. On it were drawn red ink diagrams and spells inked in black, circles of confinement, veiling sigils, and most haunting of all, a diagram of a house with a shrine beneath it. "This house," Lin Yue whispered. The priest nodded. "They built the Zhao ancestral home atop her spirit. They sealed her into the foundation, trapping her within clay and bone, offering rice soaked in her name. But the ritual was flawed. They didn't give her a proper burial. They didn't honor her passing. They didn't give her peace. They gave her hunger." Wen ran his hand through his hair, face pale. "And now, she's still there, under the floorboards." "Waiting," the priest said. "For what?" Lin Yue asked, though she already knew. "To be a bride, to wear the veil, to be recognized." Silence fell between them like a stone in deep water. The priest continued, voice lower now, almost reverent. "Every firstborn Zhao son who marries before honoring her dies, drowned, alone, their mouths full of black rice, their souls dragged beneath. It's happened 5 times. Your uncle, your cousin, even a nephew born of your father's estranged brother. They never spoke of it to you. They thought by staying away, the curse would sleep. But it doesn't. It watches." He nodded. "And you've awakened it." The priest gave them one last warning. "If you intend to marry on that land, she will come for him, unless the proper ritual is done." "What ritual?" Wen asked, his voice tender. The old man's eyes grew distant. "A severing, a moonlit ritual to unbind the bride, but it comes with a price. To break a wedding vow from the dead, you must give something of equal weight. You must offer a soul, either hers or your own." Lin Yue looked at Wen, whose jaw was set, but whose eyes trembled. They left the temple in silence. The wind had picked up. The clouds were low. The fog refused to leave the treetops. Back at the house, everything felt closer. The walls, the air, the weight. That night, the dreams changed. Lin Yue found herself walking down a corridor of bones. The walls were made of skulls, all grinning, all mouthing her name. At the end of the hall was a mirror, the first she had seen in weeks. In its reflection was a bride in red, her face wrapped in burial gauze, holding out a comb. Lin Yue reached for it, but the bride leaned close, and from under the veil came a voice like water. "If you love him, take my place." Lin Yue woke to find her pillow soaked again, not just wet, sticky with blackened rice water. She screamed. Wen rushed in, his face pale, his arms cold. "She was here," Lin Yue whispered. "She was in the bed. I felt her next to me. I dreamed I was drowning again, but this time I wanted to go under." They didn't sleep after that. At dawn, they visited the oldest villager in Tanxi, a blind woman named Granny Lao, who had once served as a midwife and spirit reader. She lived in a hut near the forest, surrounded by cages of birds that never sang. When they arrived, she already had 2 cups of tea waiting. "I felt her move last night," she said, though no one had spoken yet. "The bone bride is awake. She's tasting the air again." When asked the same question, "How do we stop it?" Granny Lao's answer was cold. "You can't, not without finishing what your ancestors began. Either marry her spirit or burn her altar and free her soul. But if you burn the altar, the spirit won't vanish. It will become untethered. And that's worse than a bride. That's a vengeful widow." Lin Yue whispered, "And if I take her place?" The old woman turned her blind eyes towards her. "Then you must wear the veil, sleep in her bed, walk in her footsteps, and be buried with her bones." Neither of them spoke. Granny Lao only smiled with no joy. "You can't build a house over a curse and expect it to shelter love." That night, the veil reappeared on their bed, folded, waiting, the comb beside it, and written on the mirror in lines of wet ash, "One bride must remain." It began with a single drop, not from the sky, but from the ceiling, an errant tap of cold water landing in the center of the ancestral altar, right between the 2 burned-down candles. Lin Yue watched it fall, expecting more, but nothing followed. The ceiling above was dry, unstained, untouched by leak or storm. Still, the air smelled of wet soil and river reeds, as if the house had shifted locations overnight and now sat beside a drowned bank. By noon, the storm arrived in earnest. Bark clouds rolled across the sky like bruises spreading over flesh. The villagers pulled their windows shut and hung red papers on their doors, each bearing the same character, bold and slashed in black ink: Chen, to suppress, to keep evil spirits from entering during monsoon. Tanxi was silent by sunset, save for the weeping rain. Inside the house, Lin Yue moved slowly. Her ears picked up things that Wen didn't seem to notice: the soft pad of wet footsteps on wood, the rattle of doors that had been locked, the sound of something breathing just behind the thin paper walls. Every gust of wind carried with it a murmur like voices from under a river. Wen stayed in the study most of the day, poring over the scroll the Taoist had given them. He didn't speak much. His eyes were darker now, more sunken. His hands trembled when he poured tea. "Do you hear it?" Lin Yue asked him once. He didn't answer. Because he did, and pretending otherwise was easier. That evening, the power flickered and failed. The house filled with shadows. The only light came from the shrine candles, and even they burned with a bluish tint, low and unsteady. Around midnight, it began. First, the smell, floodwater and rot, like something dead had been pulled from a well. Then came the sounds, wet dragging, heavy footsteps that didn't match anyone living. And finally, the knocking. It came from above, from the attic. Wen stared at the ceiling, frozen. Lin Yue whispered, "No one has been up there since we arrived." He didn't move. The knocking continued. 3 slow knocks, then silence, then 3 again. She rose, holding a flashlight, and made her way toward the old ladder that led into the attic crawl space. Each step creaked, The air grew colder the higher she climbed. By the time her hand reached the trapdoor handle, her fingers had gone numb. She pulled it open. The light flickered as she shined it into the attic. It was empty. Almost. In the far corner sat a red wedding chest, its lacquer chipped, its gold inlay faded into black. A veil hung over the side, long, tattered, soaked through with rain that had no business being there. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, pooling around the chest. As she approached, the chest creaked slightly, its lid lifting just a hair, just enough for something to slip back inside. Lin Yue stopped breathing. She stepped back. The attic door slammed shut behind her. She screamed. Downstairs, Wen ran for her, but by the time he reached the ladder, she was already climbing down, pale, shivering, her hands scratched. "There's something up there, something waiting." That night, she slept with the comb under her pillow, not for protection, but because part of her believed the spirit wouldn't come for her if she kept it close, like a token, like a bridal gift. But she was wrong. The next morning, they found muddy footprints in the hallway, small, barefoot, trailing water from the front door to the altar. The door had never opened. The lock was still engaged. More than that, on the walls long claw marks had appeared, deep, splintering the wood as though something had been trying to climb out, not in. And on the altar, the offerings had changed again. The bowl no longer held rice. It held teeth, human, small, yellowed, some broken. Lin Yue vomited. Wen didn't react, because he had begun to dream in another language now, one that tasted like ash and smelled like riverweed. He heard her voice clearly each night, the bone bride whispering from beneath the floor. "Say the vows, let me walk." By the third night of rain, the house was no longer theirs. The doors opened to rooms that hadn't existed. The mirrors showed things they hadn't done. Lin Yue passed by the hallway window and saw a second version of herself, standing alone in the rain, holding a red umbrella with her face wrapped in white gauze. That version smiled. In the kitchen, the kettle screamed without heat. In the closet, the wedding dress Lin Yue had brought from the city had changed, its ivory fabric now stained deep red, as though soaked in blood. She hadn't touched it. She burned it in the yard. The flame hissed, the fabric shrieked as it curled into ash. Wen only watched. That night, they tried to leave. Wen packed 2 bags. Lin Yue grabbed the car keys. The rain was pounding the village into submission. They ran through the main gate and down the old path, but each road seemed to loop back toward the house, again to the front door, again to the red lantern that should have been blown out but still glowed dimly. They tried 4 times, each one faster, each one more frantic, each time the same result. The house would not let them leave. When they re-entered the 5th time, the veil was waiting on the floor, spread like a welcome mat. The comb sat on top of it, and the cracked porcelain bowl now held a folded note. Wen picked it up, his face drained. He read aloud, "Rain is the veil, water is the vow. Say her name or drown." They stayed awake all night. Lin Yue sat in the hall, her eyes wide, her lips murmuring silent prayers to spirits she barely believed in. Wen stared at the floor where he swore he could see something moving beneath the wood, like a woman pacing below, just beneath their feet, brushing the underside with her fingers. By dawn, the storm had stopped. The village emerged slowly from the fog. But Tanxi had changed. On every door hung red thread. On every gate old women stood watching. Some wept, some sang. All of them turned away as Wen passed, as if unable to look him in the eyes, because they knew. She comes with the rain, and the rain always returns. The sky remained still, but the silence held the weight of something watching. After 3 nights of rain, the air in Tanxi didn't smell of renewal. It reeked of stagnation, of swollen wood and old secrets breathing again. Every villager that passed the Zhao ancestral house did so without sound, their eyes lowered, their steps hurried. It was as if the entire village had conspired to look away. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. The walls were damper than before, even though the storm had passed. Every surface felt faintly sticky, as if touched by unclean hands. The comb remained on the altar now, unmoving, its presence no longer subtle. It belonged there, like it had always belonged. Wen hadn't slept. He sat at the table, eyes bloodshot, translating the fragments from the Taoist scroll. Symbols of binding, verses of offering, names scratched out and rewritten. Lin Yue watched him, her worry growing sharper with every hour. "She's asking for something," Wen said, voice hoarse. "The dreams, the altar, the rain, they're signs." "She wants a ritual," Lin Yue murmured. "No, she wants a wedding." He looked up at her. "She wants me." Lin Yue's hands trembled. "Then what do we do?" "We give her what she wants," Wen said. "A symbolic offering, enough to satisfy her spirit, something to recognize the marriage and put her at peace." He pulled out the scroll again, laying it flat. In the margins, handwritten notes, old ink in his grandfather's hand. A brief reference to the offering of blood and bone, a ritual said to calm a spirit bride before a living wedding. "It has to be done on the 6th day before the real wedding, tonight," Wen said. Lin Yue's chest tightened. "What kind of offering?" Wen hesitated. Then, quietly, "A strand of hair from the bride, a drop of blood from the groom, rice soaked in river water, and a flame to guide her spirit back to her chamber." They gathered what they could. Lin Yue silently pulled her hair into a loose braid and clipped a single black strand. Wen sliced the tip of his finger with a knife from the kitchen, letting a drop fall into the bowl. The river water was already in the house. It had been soaking into the floorboards for days. Lin Yue scooped it from beneath the altar where it had pooled. They lit a single red candle, placed everything on the shrine. Wen spoke the words from the scroll in a voice that trembled. He bowed 3 times, offered the comb, and lit a stick of incense. But the moment the flame caught, something shifted. The air grew dense. The candle's flame bent sideways. The rice in the bowl began to bubble, small ripples spreading outward like something beneath the surface had moved. Then the shrine snuffed out the candle. Smoke filled the room. Lin Yue coughed, choking, stumbling back. The incense ash curled into a new pattern on the altar. 3 characters, fresh, drawn in soot. Not enough. Wen paled. "She's rejecting it. She wants more," Lin Yue whispered. "She wants you." The house moaned as if in agreement. That night, the dreams came again. This time, clearer. Lin Yue stood in a bridal chamber lit with red lanterns. The walls were draped in silk, a bed, empty, a table set for two, and across from her, seated patiently, a bride in crimson, her face wrapped in gauze, her hands folded politely, her veil trembling. When Lin Yue tried to speak, the bride turned her head and said one sentence, "He belongs to me." Lin Yue awoke sobbing. Wen didn't wake at all. She shook him, desperate. His skin was cold. Finally, he gasped, as if pulled from deep water. "I was under. She took me under again." Lin Yue looked at the shrine. The bowl of rice was now empty. But something else had been left in return. A tooth. His. One of Wen's molars sat in the bowl, fresh, red at the root. He hadn't noticed it was gone. That morning they went to the village elder, the same woman who had spat at them on their first day. She sat on her stool, shelling peas into a bowl with hands that never stopped moving. "You tried the offering," she said flatly, before they could speak. "Yes," Lin Yue replied. "She rejected it." The old woman sighed. "Because you used a mirror." Lin Yue blinked. "What?" "The water you used," the elder said, "from under the altar. It wasn't just water. It reflected her image. That makes it a mirror in spirit terms. Mirrors are forbidden in such offerings. You didn't open a path for her. You opened a doorway." Lin Yue's heart dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means she can move now. She can walk." Wen pressed his hand to his cheek where the missing tooth throbbed. "Then what do we do?" The old woman's hands stopped shelling. "You don't run. She'll only follow. You don't hide. She'll find you in dreams. You either marry her properly, or you find her bones and burn her binding thread." "But the Taoists said burning would release her into vengeance," Lin Yue said. The woman nodded slowly. "Yes, but it would also break the chain. The curse is a loop. You cut it, she's free. She will no longer be yours, but she will never stop hunting. Choose carefully." That night, the house felt like it was leaning inward, the walls closer, the shadows deeper, the window panes fogged with no breath, and in the corner of their bedroom, the veil had returned, folded neatly over the foot of the bed, the comb resting atop it, a single word embroidered in the hemline: "Soon." The veil no longer stayed hidden. It now moved openly between rooms, like a guest with rights. Sometimes it draped itself across the altar. Other times it appeared folded neatly on the bed, or hanging limply over the back of a chair, still wet as though pulled from a river. Lin Yue stopped trying to move it. Wen wouldn't touch it at all. They began to live around it, as if it were furniture, as if denying its presence might deny its power. But it was too late for that. The morning after the failed offering, Wen went looking for answers deeper than incense and ash. There was one room in the house that had remained locked since their arrival. It belonged to his late uncle, Zhao Wen, the last firstborn son to die in Tanxi on his wedding night. The door had no key, but the lock was old, brittle. Wen broke it with a rusted chisel and a heavy hand. Inside, the air was still and dry, as though the room had been sealed in a vacuum of grief. Dust blanketed every surface. The bed had not been touched in years, the red bedding now faded to brown. On the wall hung a wedding portrait, its glass cracked, the bride's face smeared by moisture damage. Zhao Wei's eyes, however, were clear, sharp, as though he still stared through the frame. On the vanity sat a pair of red wedding shoes, molded, warped, and still damp. When Wen reached for them, something moved inside. He dropped them. One shoe landed on its side, revealing a scrap of paper tucked into the lining. A note, old, ink smudged, written by Zhao Wen in desperate slanted strokes. She came before the vows. She crawled from the floor and stood beside my bride. The mirror cracked. The rice turned black. I begged, but she said, "You promised first. Don't let them marry here again. This house is hers now." Lin Yue read the note twice, her lips trembling. "Why didn't anyone tell you this?" she whispered. Wen shook his head. "My father said Zhao Wen had a heart condition, said he died in his sleep. But he didn't." "No," Wen's voice was hollow. "He drowned in a locked room on dry ground." Lin Yue stepped closer to the vanity. Something glinted between the candle holders. She pulled it free, a small red silk pouch, stiff with age. Inside were fragments of bone, a sliver of jaw, 3 baby teeth, and hair, long, black, and bound with red thread. She dropped it with a cry. That night the dreams returned for Wen, but they weren't dreams anymore. He woke in the hallway, soaked in water, barefoot, the comb clutched in his fist. The floor beneath him was wet. Lin Yue found him there just before dawn, shivering violently. "I didn't walk here," he said. "She brought me." In the days that followed, Wen began to change. He forgot things, important things. He stared at the altar for hours without blinking. Once Lin Yue found him humming a wedding song she'd never taught him. His voice was flat, rhythmic, like a chant. And worse, he started speaking in a dialect neither of them recognized. Words that twisted in the mouth, words that made candles flicker and mirrors shudder. Lin Yue began to search the house for more remnants of Zhao Wen, more proof, more patterns. In the attic, behind a stack of rotten prayer scrolls, she found a journal. His last entries told the truth. "She waits beneath the house. I hear her combing her hair through the floorboards, every night at the same hour. I offered rice, but she wants more. She wants the name. She wants the vow. My bride is afraid. She saw her in the mirror yesterday, the one we tried to cover. The red veil floated in our room again. It's always wet." The final page was a scrawl of overlapping ink, written in the same phrase repeated over and over until the words bled into madness. The bride before all others, the bride who was never chosen, the bride who never left. That evening, Wen sat by the altar in silence. His lips were moving, but no sound escaped. Lin Yue leaned close. He was mouthing her name. Not Lin Yue's name. Zhao Shu. She shook him. "Stop it! You have to stop!" He blinked at her slow, as if waking from a trance. "I dreamed she was lying next to me," he said, "wearing your face." Lin Yue backed away. That night she locked the bedroom door. She didn't tell Wen, but she began sleeping with a knife under the pillow. The house grew colder, even as the days turned to summer. Mold bloomed in corners that had never seen moisture. Red thread began appearing in places they hadn't tied, wrapped around doorknobs, draped over the mirrors, tangled in the legs of the altar table. And then came the night Lin Yue heard 2 sets of footsteps walking down the hall towards her room, both barefoot, one heavier, one light, wet. They stopped at the door. She waited, breath caught in her throat, knife trembling in her grip. Then, nothing, until the sound of a comb being drawn through long, dripping hair began just outside the door. In the morning, A wedding invitation lay at their doorstep, not printed, handwritten in blood-red ink. It read, "You are invited to witness the unbinding and rebinding of the original vow. Groom, Zhao Wen. Bride, Zhao Shu. Date, 7th night from tonight. Location, beneath the altar. Dress code, red." There was no signature, just the imprint of a comb pressed into the parchment.
It rained again on the 6th night. Not a storm, but a steady drizzle that soaked the red threads hanging from the trees outside the Zhao ancestral home. The air clung to the skin like breath trapped beneath cloth, and the ground seemed to swell beneath their feet, soft with the memory of what was buried beneath. Lin Yu stood in front of the family shrine long after the candles had burned down. The silence wasn't quiet anymore. It was listening. The walls listened, the floorboards whispered, the house breathed with things long dead. She had stopped asking questions. Now she just watched. The comb was gone. So was the veil. They hadn't moved them. They had simply disappeared. Wen sat in the main hall, unmoving, eyes fixed on the crack in the altar wood. It had widened overnight, and from within it, something had begun to speak. Not with words, but with sound. A low, clicking rhythm, like bone striking stone, a pattern. It repeated every few seconds, like a chant made of teeth. Wen began to repeat it unconsciously, tapping the rhythm with his fingers against his knee. Lin Yu begged him to stop. He only blinked, slowly. "She's almost here. I can feel her combing her hair through the clay." That evening, Wen returned to the Taoist scrolls. By lantern light, he traced the characters he'd once ignored, the ones scrawled in the margins, written in a shaking hand. They told of a binding ritual performed by the desperate, of spirits forced into obedience by anchoring them in objects, bones, hair, red cloth, and clay. Clay was sacred, clay was final. The Zhao family, unable to bury Zhao Su properly, had buried her in pieces, bones wrapped in silk, bound with thread, then sealed in a clay urn beneath the house. They hadn't built a home to mourn her. They had built a prison, and she had never stopped screaming beneath it. Lin Yu decided then, they had to find it. At midnight, they returned to the crawl space beneath the guest room floor, the same hidden cavity where the first shrine had been discovered. The air was thicker now, hot, wet, close. The walls wept moisture. The dirt was slick with something that smelled like rotting jasmine. They brought tools, lanterns, salt, but they also brought fear. Beneath the altar, past the offerings and blackened rice, Wen found a stone lid, buried under layers of damp soil. They scraped at it with their fingers, mud caking their nails. As the last of the dirt came away, they revealed the seal. 2 characters painted in faded blood. Chun Hun, imprisoned marriage. Lin Yu touched the lid. The clay was warm, too warm, and beneath her fingers it beat once, like a pulse. Wen didn't hesitate. He smashed the seal with the butt of the flashlight. The clay cracked, and the whispers poured out. It was not wind, not air, it was breath. Hundreds of trapped breaths, stolen from the dead, escaping all at once. The air turned black with ash. Their lantern flickered, then blew out. But the lid lifted on its own. Inside sat the remains of a binding urn, a thick clay jar split down the side, oozing black water from within.
Inside it, tangled silk and fragments of bone, a rib cage, a jawbone, a comb pressed flat by time, and the red veil wrapped around it all like a mother's arms. At the center, sealed into the clay, was a single glass eye. Lin Yu screamed. Wen dropped to his knees. The air trembled around them. From the shadows of the crawl space, a voice rose, not spoken aloud, but breathed into the bones of the house. "You broke the seal. You brought me back. You said the vow." The walls of the crawl space began to shudder. Cracks spread from the altar above. The floorboards flexed like something was crawling beneath them. Wen clutched the edge of the urn. She was never honored. She was stolen. He turned to Lin Yu. "We have to finish the ritual." She shook her head. "The Taoist said we'd need her skull under moonlight. But if we take it out, then we'll trap her again." "No," Wen said, his voice distant. "We marry her. That's the only way she'll stop. The ritual never complete. She was bound, not joined." Lin Yu stared at him. "You can't be serious." But Wen reached into the urn, trembling, and lifted the veil from around the bones. It came away slow, wet, still clinging to fragments of flesh like cobwebs to fingers. And the house fell silent. That night, they said nothing to each other. They sat on opposite sides of the shrine room. The comb lay on the altar once more. The veil hung from the ceiling beam. And Wen, he no longer looked like Wen. His eyes were darker now, his voice slower, his heartbeat silent when Lin Yu pressed her ear to his chest in the early hours before dawn. She whispered his name. He didn't respond. Just before sleep took her, she saw the urn again, resting in the crawl space below. But now there was something new inside it. A photograph, old, yellowed. It was her own face, staring back from the picture frame, wearing the veil. It began with the sound of dripping again. Not a leak, not rain, something slower, rhythmic, intentional. Drip, pause, drip. It echoed through the house like a metronome in the dark, guiding their breath, counting down to something neither of them could name. Lin Yue opened her eyes before the sun rose and found herself staring at the ceiling. It was soaked. Water bloomed across the plaster like veins, black, branching, pulsing faintly. It was still dry outside, but inside the house, something had changed. When she swung her feet to the floor, her toes sank into water, a thin layer stretching across the wood like a shallow tide, cold as river stone. No pipes had burst, no roof had caved in, but the water was there, quiet and watching. She rose carefully, heart pounding, and stepped into the hallway. Her reflection followed her in the floor's surface, but it lagged slightly, off by half a second. It blinked when she didn't. The smell was growing stronger now. Mold, silt, jasmine turned sour. Lin Yue covered her nose with her sleeve as she passed the study and noticed the walls. They were rotting. Not peeling, rotting, as if the wood had soaked through to its core and begun to dissolve. On the family portraits, faces had melted, eyes had smudged, some had disappeared altogether. The ancestors were losing form, losing voice. She found Wen sitting in the corner of the altar room, knees drawn to his chest, shirt soaked through, lips pale. "I dreamed of her again," he whispered. Lin Yue knelt. What did she say?" "She didn't say anything," he murmured. "She just stared. She had your hands, your mouth, but when she opened it," he swallowed hard, "water poured out into mine, and I didn't stop her." That day, the mirror in the hallway cracked on its own. The glass curled inward as if something had breathed against it from behind. Red threads appeared tied across the door frames in new patterns, symbols that Lin Yue couldn't translate but felt deep in her bones. The villagers had stopped coming near the house. Even Granny Liao had sent word to stay inside, that tonight would be the night. Because tonight was the 7th night before the wedding, the hour of unbinding, the one foretold in every scroll and whispered legend, the one where a choice must be made. And so, as dusk bled into evening, Lin Yue lit the candles herself. She swept the shrine clean. She dressed in a red qipao, not for ceremony, but for protection, and she placed salt across the windowsills. Still, when the clock struck midnight, the house breathed out. The walls exhaled steam. The air grew thick, and Wen stood on his own, barefoot, face unreadable, and walked into the bedroom without saying a word. Lin Yue followed him. The room was underwater, not truly, but spiritually, flooded in presence. Every surface glistened with condensation. The bed was soaked. The rug floated just above the floorboards, and from the corners of the room came soft rippling sounds, like hands disturbing still water. She stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The door shut behind her on its own. Wen stood by the window, staring into the night. "She's already here," he said. Then he turned to face her. But it wasn't Wen, not fully. His eyes were black at the edges, like the ink-stained prayers on the scrolls. His breath came out in gusts of mist, and beneath his skin something shimmered, the shape of a woman, veiled, layered like a second soul trying to wear his body from the inside. "She's waiting in the clay," he whispered, "but she's tired of waiting." Lin Yue backed away. "Fight her, Wen," she said. He smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "I already did," he said softly. "She'd let me come back, but only if I bring you." The floor began to fill. Real water now, rising from the cracks between boards, cold, black. It crept past their ankles, their knees, reaching higher with every breath. Lin Yue ran for the door. It didn't open. She screamed his name, but he only watched her, blankly, head tilted. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he walked into the water and sank without resistance, like it had been waiting to swallow him. She dove after him, arms thrashing, but there was no bottom. The room was endless, the water too deep. She swam down, breath burning, searching for his hand, his face, anything, but all she found was a veil wrapped around her throat. It tightened, dragged. Darkness swallowed her. And then she woke on the floor, coughing violently, water gushing from her mouth, lungs, nose. Her hands clawed at the boards, her vision blurred. Wen lay beside her, unconscious, his skin cold. The room was dry. No water, no veil, no trace of flooding, but under the bed a trail of wet footprints led away from them, toward the crawl space, toward the altar. Later, after she revived him, Wen didn't remember what happened. Not fully. But Lin Yue remembered everything. Because while she had drowned, for that moment between breaths, she had seen. She had been in Jiao Shu's chamber, a room underground, walls made of clay. Bone combs lined the shelves, wedding shoes floated in stagnant water, and in the center sat the bone bride, smiling, hair coiled around her like seaweed, wearing Lin Yue's face. And she whispered, "You may keep his heart, but I keep his soul." The sun rose gray and thin over Tanxi, its light fractured by mist, its warmth unable to touch the house. Wen and Lin Yue hadn't spoken since the drowning. He stayed in bed, barely moving, his skin too pale, his breath too shallow. When she looked at her, it was with a question in his eyes, one he no longer had the strength to ask. Lin Yue didn't have an answer anyway, because something had shifted. Not just in the house or in Wen, but in the boundary between the living and the dead. She could feel it when she stepped outside, how the trees leaned closer to the road, how the villagers no longer lit incense in the morning, how the birds had gone completely silent. Even the dogs wouldn't bark near the house anymore. She returned to the Taoist shrine at midday. The temple was darker than before and colder. He greeted her with eyes already filled with grief. "I know why you've come," he said. Lin Yue set the comb on the mat between them, its bone teeth darkened from the crawl space's damp. She tried to take him. The Taoist nodded slowly. "She's already taken part of him. The rest will follow unless you sever the vow before the wedding night." "But how?" she asked. "The offerings didn't work. The altar rejected us. She doesn't want peace. She wants the past." "She wants to be seen, not as a ghost, as a bride." Lin Yue shivered. "She wants to be married?" "She already was in ritual, but not in presence, not in honor. The marriage was one-sided, a prison, not a bond. That's why she devours the ones who follow. The curse is her voice." "So how do we undo it?" she asked. The Taoist unrolled a scroll, one older than the last. The paper was brittle, nearly crumbling under his fingers. "There's one ritual," he said, "called the severing of red threads. It is not a blessing. It is not kind. It was used only in the most cursed of unions, where one spirit refused to let go of a living soul." Her voice dropped. "What does it require?" The Taoist met her eyes. "You must retrieve her skull, place it under moonlight to reveal her final name. Speak that name at midnight on the 7th day before your wedding. Then you must place the skull on the altar and complete the severing with a ritual knife dipped in the blood of both the living and the bound." Her stomach turned. "And then it ends?" she asked. The Taoist was silent. "There is one more condition," he finally said. "The ritual demands a substitute. A soul must stay. One bride goes, one bride remains." Lin Yue felt the air leave her lungs. "You mean—" "Yes," the Taoist said. "If you wish to free him, you must take her place in the binding. It is the law of the broken union. No spirit leaves unless another stays behind." The silence between them grew heavy. Finally, Lin Yue whispered, "If I refuse?" "Then he dies," the priest said, "without mercy. And she walks in your skin for the rest of her days." Lin Yue stood slowly, the weight of choice pressing into her shoulders. As she turned to go, the Taoist reached out one final time. "Beware," he said. "If you hesitate during the ritual, if the name is not spoken cleanly, if the moonlight is blocked, the bond will turn violent, and the bone bride will become something far worse." "What happens then?" The Taoist did not answer. He only blew out the candle. When Lin Yue returned to the house, she found Wen standing in the ancestral hall, awake, alert, but distant. He was drawing on the walls in chalk, symbols she couldn't read, geometric and curling, older than any language she recognized. He turned in her and smiled faintly. "She showed me how," he said. "How what?" "How to prepare the room," he replied. "She says it has to look a certain way for the wedding." Lin Yue stepped forward and gently took the chalk from his hand. "No more drawings. We're not finishing her wedding. We're ending it." Wen blinked, confused. "She's waiting, Lin. I can't leave her now, not after what she showed me." "What did she show you?" she asked softly. He leaned in, whispered against her cheek. "What the world looks like when it's made of water, when all the faces turn to salt, when you finally stop breathing and it feels like home." She stepped back in horror, but he smiled again, dreamily, tenderly. That night, Lin Yue went into the crawl space alone. She brought the Taoist scroll, a lantern, and gloves. The urn was still there, its clay cracked further, pulsing faintly with something warm. She reached in slowly, fingers trembling, and pulled the skull from the velvet silk. It came away with a sigh, an audible breath that wasn't hers. She wrapped it in red cloth, carried it upstairs, and waited for the moon. It was full that night, bright, perfect. At the stroke of midnight, she placed the skull on the altar and unwrapped it. Moonlight washed over the bone, and beneath the surface something shifted. Letters appeared, etched into the curve of the forehead. Zhao Shi, and beneath it another line in much smaller script. The bride buried without name. Lin Yue bowed 3 times, then whispered, "Zhao Shi, I call you to the surface. I call you to your name. I end the silence that bound you." The candles blew out on their own, and from the floor beneath her, something began to climb. The house did not shake, it breathed. Each floorboard swelled with pressure, each window fogged with a breath not exhaled by any living thing. The walls sweated, the beams creaked, the red threads hanging from the ceiling fluttered without wind. It was not an earthquake, it was not weather, it was the sensation of something long buried beginning to move. Lin Yue stood before the altar, the skull of Zhao Zu unwrapped and resting in the moonlight. Her hands trembled, stained with clay and old ink. The red cloth lay discarded beside her like a shed skin. The moonlight was strong tonight, unbroken, clear. It poured through the cracked ceiling in a single shaft, hitting the altar like a spotlight, a stage. The name had already been revealed. Zhao Zu, her name carved in silence, finally spoken aloud. The air had shifted when Lin Yue said it, turned dense like the moments before thunder. But the ritual was not complete. It required the severing. Wen stood behind her, barefoot, silent, a candle in each hand. His eyes were wide, black-rimmed. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "Are you ready?" she asked, not turning. His voice came slow, dreamlike. "I've been ready since the day we arrived." She opened the ritual scroll. The Taoist's instructions were detailed and absolute. This was not a prayer, it was a command. To sever a bond so deep, the spirit must be drawn out, recognized fully, and then released through flame, moonlight, and blood. Lin Yue took the ritual knife, a thin, curved blade blessed with salt and black ash, and cut her palm slowly, deliberately. Blood welled. She let it drip into a small bowl. Then she took Wen's hand, opened his palm, and did the same. Their blood mixed. It turned dark, thick, sluggish. The moment it touched the skull, the candles flared to life, though none were lit. A gust of wind rose from the floor, upward, as if from some cavern below. And then came the sound. Hair combing through hair. But now, louder, close. Lin Yue turned. From the far end of the room, just beyond the threshold, stood the Bone Bride. No longer a whisper, no longer a glimpse in the mirror. She was here. Tall, elegant, soaked in black water. Her red kipao clung to her body like skin peeled back. Her veil was torn, but still in place, hiding the face that had ruined so many dreams. Her hands were folded in front of her, holding the comb like a blade, and her eyes, now visible through the veil, were not empty. They were Lin Yue's. She stepped forward. Each step left a puddle. Lin Yue raised the knife. Zhao Zhu, you were betrayed. You were buried without your name. But I call you now. I name you. I see you. And I sever this vow. The candles flickered. The wind screamed. But the Bone Bride did not stop. She stepped closer. Now, just 10 feet away. Lin Yue stepped forward as well, holding out the skull like an offering. This is your face, your silence, your cage. I break it. The moment the skull passed fully through the moonbeam, a crack split the air. The altar burst open behind them, wood flying like shards of bone. From beneath, the urn shattered fully, and water gushed upward, flooding the room. But it wasn't water. It was memory. Lin Yue gasped as vision struck her mind. A young girl drowned in a shallow river, hands pulling her body from the reeds, rituals whispered in shadows, her bones stolen, her soul called against her will. And worst of all, the wedding. No guests, no music, but a corpse in robes, a groom who never opened his eyes, and Zhao Zhu standing there in spirit, watching herself be bound to a bloodline that never wanted her, never honored her. Tears streamed down Lin Yue's cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You were never meant to be buried in silence." The Bone Bride paused, veil trembling, hands twitching. Lin Yue stepped forward one final time. "If you must take a bride," she said, voice breaking, "take me, but let him go." Wen cried out behind her, "No!" But it was too late. The Bone Bride lunged, not at Wen, but at Lin Yue. Her hands went around Lin Yue's throat, but not to choke, but to hold, to recognize, to claim. And then everything stopped. The candles froze mid-flicker. The wind ceased. Even the water on the floor no longer rippled. Time itself held its breath. The Bone Bride leaned close. From beneath the veil, her mouth moved, but the words were not spoken aloud. They were given. "You saw me." And then she released Lin Yue, stepped back, and began to burn. Not in flame, but in moonlight. Her form fractured, red threads unraveled from her limbs, spinning upward like smoke. Her kipao faded, turning to ash. Her veil floated to the floor. Her hands disappeared last, still gripping the comb until the end. When it was over, the room was empty. The skull on the altar now dry, hollow, silent. The water gone. Only the veil remained, folded neatly, untouched. Lin Yue fell to her knees. Wen rushed forward, gathering her in his arms. "It's done," she whispered. He didn't speak, because in that moment she knew the spirit had been freed, but a door had opened, and something else had noticed. They didn't speak of it the next morning, not with words. Wen rose before the light and sat at the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. Lin Yue watched from the doorway, her fingers curled around the edge of the wall like a child afraid to enter a room already inhabited by someone else. Someone not quite the same. The house had gone quiet, not peaceful, empty. The air no longer hummed, the floor no longer whispered. The black water stains had faded. The red threads had fallen to the ground and curled into themselves like shed skin. Even the shrine had gone cold. The comb was gone, the skull had crumbled into powder during the night, and the altar now held only a small bowl of white rice and a single, unlit candle. And yet, the veil remained. It had been folded and left on the altar after the ritual, but now it was back in their room, draped over the foot of the bed, swaying lightly though no wind moved it. Wen hadn't touched it. Lin Yue hadn't dared. When she picked it up, it felt heavier than before, damp again, like it had been dipped in memory. She placed it into a box and tied it shut, but by afternoon it was out again, resting on the dresser, staring at her with no eyes but presence. The wedding was 5 days away. The villagers avoided them now entirely. No more visits, no more warnings, no more chants from Granny Liao's house. Just silence, the kind that refuses to be broken. That evening, Lin Yue found a mark on the mirror above the sink, a red thumbprint pressed to the glass from the inside. It pulsed faintly when she looked at it. She cleaned it. It returned. That night she dreamed of the wedding, but not hers. She stood at the altar wearing a red veil, hands bound with red thread. The groom across from her was Wen, but he was pale, waterlogged, his mouth sewn shut with black hair. The guests were villagers with no eyes. Their claps were soundless. Their mouths moved in slow, wet gasps. At the end of the ceremony, the groom leaned close. When she lifted her veil, she saw her own face on the bride's body, but not her soul behind the eyes. The bride smiled. I waited. She woke in tears. Beside her, Wen still slept, but not soundly. He murmured in his sleep a single name over and over. Zhao Shu, Zhao Shu, Zhao Shu. And worse, he was smiling. The next day, Lin Yue returned to the attic. Something drew her there. She had avoided it since the first time, since the footsteps, the chest, and the dripping veil. But now it felt unfinished, incomplete. And when she pulled down the ladder and climbed into the dusty dark, she found it waiting. The wedding chest had been moved. No longer in the corner, it now sat in the center of the attic, directly beneath the skylight. A shaft of light touched its lid. The dust around it had been brushed clean, forming a circle of water stains. The chest was cracked slightly open. Inside, her wedding dress, the one she had burned. But here it was, restored, sewn back together with black thread, drenched in red dye, glistening. When she reached to touch it, the chest slammed shut on its own. Behind her, the attic door creaked. She turned. No one. But the veil she had hidden, boxed, sealed, floated slowly down the ladder like it had climbed up ahead of her. Lin Yue screamed. She didn't tell Wen. Instead, she began preparing to leave. They couldn't stay. The ritual had freed Zhao Shu, but she hadn't gone. She had lingered, changed, waited. The severing might have ended the curse, but it had opened something wider, older. That night, as Lin Yue packed, the house grew still again, until the doorbell rang. Once, then silence. Wen opened it. A single villager stood there, an old man, hunched, eyes clouded with cataracts, mouth trembling. He held out a wedding invitation. But this one was newer, clean, crisp. It was written in Lin Yue's handwriting. The bride is ready. The altar is set. Come bear witness to the final vow. Beneath the signature, a drop of blood. Lin Yue's own blood. But she had never written it. She dropped the envelope. The wind caught it, blew it across the yard. And from the trees, hanging low, red veils fluttered like lanterns, hundreds of them strung between the branches, whispering in fabric. She turned to Wen, desperate. "We have to leave." He looked past her, into the house. "No," he whispered. "We have to finish it." He stepped back inside. The door shut behind him. When she opened it again seconds later, he was gone. The house was empty. No Wen, no voice, no warmth, just a single trail of wet footprints leading from the foyer to the altar. And sitting in the center of the hall waiting for her, the veil, folded, perfect, with a note resting on top. Put it on.
The veil was waiting. Its fabric no longer looked torn or wet. It shimmered now, almost alive, pulsing faintly as though stitched from breath. When Lin Yue touched it, her fingers tingled, not cold, not warm. Recognition, as if it had known her all along, as if it had been made for her. The house was silent. No footsteps, no wind, no dripping water. It was the kind of silence only found in tombs, a hush not born from stillness, but from containment. She stepped barefoot through the hallway, every creak beneath her feet feeling like a line being crossed. There were no more portraits on the walls. Every frame had gone empty. Every ancestor had turned away. She followed the footprints, Wen's, into the shrine room. He stood there, alone, back to her. In front of him, the altar glowed faintly, not from candles, from beneath. Lin Yue touched his arm. He finally looked at her. But the man who met her gaze was no longer fully her fiancé. There was something behind his eyes, not malevolent, not hollow, but deeply tired, a spirit stretched thin. "She's not angry anymore. She just wants someone to stay," he said softly. "You don't belong to her. You never did. I was the promise, the descendant, the continuation. I carry the vow she was forced into. She doesn't want vengeance anymore, Lin. She wants presence, a companion, a shadow that doesn't fade." Lin Yue stepped between him and the altar. "Then I'll take her place." His expression broke, grief and love clashing in a single breath. "No," he said, barely audible. "No, you're not meant to stay. She doesn't want me." Lin Yue reached into her pocket. She pulled out the last remnant of the binding, a thread of black hair twined around a chipped comb tooth. She held it up. "She came to me. She asked for a bride that wasn't just metaphor. She was asking for witness, for someone to honor her, to see her, and I did. I do." Wen looked down. The floor beneath the altar cracked, a slow circle of stone opening, revealing the ritual pit, the very place where Zhao Shu's bones had been bound in clay. But now the space below was deeper, darker, filled with mist. There were stairs, carved from stone, a path downward. From the depths came a hum, not a scream, not a chant, a lullaby,
ancient, woven with sorrow. It pulled at Lin Yue like gravity. She turned back to Wen, her tears in her eyes. "If I go down there, you stay." He opened his mouth to protest, but the wind returned, and with it Zhao Shu. Not as a ghost, not as a woman, as mist. She rose from the cracks in the floor, her form swirling behind Lin Yue, her veil suspended like a second skin. She no longer looked drowned, she looked like memory made flesh. She stood before Lin Yue, face still covered. Lin Yue bowed. "I release you from your silence." The spirit tilted her head, veil trembling. "I offer myself in your place." The veil floated from her hands, slowly, and wrapped around Lin Yue's shoulders like a shawl. The spirit stepped closer. Her hands brushed Lin Yue's face, and in that moment, everything slowed. Lin Yue saw it all. Zhao Shu as a child dancing in a red dress, her laughter, her love for the boy she never got to marry, the betrayal, the drowning, the silence, the curse, the endless years beneath clay and floorboards, waiting for someone to say her name without fear. And then, peace. Zhao Shu bowed. Lin Yue bowed in return. Then she turned to Wen, kissed him softly, and whispered, "Live." Before he could stop her, she stepped into the mist. The stairs accepted her. The earth closed. The wind fell silent, and the veil, now empty, fluttered to the floor. Wen collapsed beside it, sobbing. The altar flickered once more, then went dark. He didn't sleep that night. He stayed by the altar, clutching the veil, repeating Lin Yue's name like a prayer against forgetting. And when dawn came, the house was still, not cursed, not haunted, just quiet. The curse was broken. The bone bride had been seen, but a soul had stayed. The villagers returned on the 8th morning. They did not knock, they did not speak. They came in silence, dressed in gray and red, with their heads bowed and their hands full of offerings, bowls of rice, lotus seeds, white candles, and small tokens carved from clay. Without asking permission, they crossed the threshold of the Zhao ancestral home for the first time in generations. And this time, the house did not reject them. They lit incense in the hallway. They bowed before the shrine. They poured sweet tea onto the altar and whispered words not meant for the living. No one mentioned the rain. No one asked for the bride. Only Granny Liao lingered. She stood beside Wen in the courtyard, eyes turned toward the trees. "She's not gone," she said. Wen didn't answer. "She's just quiet now," the old woman continued, "because someone finally listened." Wen still wore the same clothes from the night Lin Yue disappeared. His palms were bandaged. His voice was slow and careful, like someone speaking through a door that might shut at any second. He nodded once. She kept her word. "Yes," Granny Liao whispered. "She took her place, and the spirit took hers." The villagers left by dusk. Granny Liao was the last to go. Before she turned down the path, she pressed a small box into Wen's hand. "Sealed it, then bury it, not for her, for you." He opened it after she left. Inside was the veil, neatly folded, dry, still warm. He didn't cry, not this time. Instead, he returned to the shrine room, cleared the altar, and placed the veil at the center. Around it, he arranged the things Lin Yue had loved. A bracelet, a poem she once wrote on a napkin, a photo of the two of them taken on their first trip together, her favorite hair clip carved with tiny cranes. He lit a single white candle. Then he whispered, "You are not forgotten." The flame danced gently. He smiled weakly and stood. That night, he slept. For the first time in what felt like 100 years, he closed his eyes and sank into dreams that didn't taste like river water or candle smoke. In the dream, Lin Yue sat across from him in a garden. She wore red, not the qipao, but a casual dress, light and soft. Her hair was down, her hands were clean. She didn't speak, she only smiled. And behind her, a figure sat quietly in the shade of a tree, Zhao Shu, now faceless, her form blurred, almost light. She held no comb, no veil, only silence and peace. When he woke, the house was quiet. The walls no longer wept, the mirrors stayed clear, the floors no longer creaked with footsteps that did not belong to them. Wen walked to the back garden and dug a small hole beneath the old pine tree. He placed the box inside, the veil, the photograph, a final offering, and covered it with both hands. No prayer, no chant, just breath. The wind sighed through the leaves above. And for the first time, he felt alone, but not haunted. Later, the villager said the Zhao curse had lifted, that no more sons would drown, no more brides would vanish, no more mirrors would reflect faces no one owned. But they still spoke the bone bride's name only in whispers, and they still left bowls of rice and sweet tea at the edge of the woods every spring, just in case. Because in Tanxi, some stories do not end. They simply wait, buried, watching, bound in red.